Another category of problematic chemicals that are produced are synthetic organic compounds. As you know, organic compounds are carbon-based compounds, carbon molecules that have a backbone of carbon. And these have been synthesized by humans and used for all sorts of applications. These include plastics. Plastics contain a number of different synthetic organic compounds. Fortunately, most of these are fairly harmless, but some of them are not. Solvents, such as solvents that are used to dissolve paints and apply paints, wood preservatives, and other different types of chemicals as well, some of which we'll talk about during the course of our discussion. These compounds tend to be readily absorbed by cells in the environment. They tend to be resistant to degradation, which is one of the problems that we'll talk about here in just a moment. As we've talked about in the case of pesticides, compounds that break down pretty quickly tend to be less problematic in the environment, less likely to biomagnify than compounds that break down quickly. Unfortunately, synthetic organic compounds often last a long time in the environment. And these often tend to be bioactive. And so, in other words, they interact with enzymes. They lead to the development of cancer. In the case of carcinogenicity, they may lead to the development of developmental defects. In the case of teratogenic effects, which is not on the screen, but they also may lead to mutations in the case of mutagenicity, a term we do see on the screen. Interestingly, one class of particularly problematic synthetic organic compounds are the halogenated hydrocarbons. These are hydrocarbons that have a chlorine or a bromine typically attached to their structure, and the chlorines and bromines oftentimes are attached to prolong the life of these chemicals, both in their applications, but an intentional consequence is that it increases the lifespan of these chemicals in the environment. These are oftentimes referred to as persistent organic pollutants, the POPs that we see there on the screen. We see on the lower right-hand side of the screen an outline of the structures of several halogenated hydrocarbons, and we're illustrating via this figure the bioactive nature of at least a handful of these halogenated hydrocarbons. And so inside the square, we have 17-beta estradiol. This is the estrogen, primary estrogen at least, that's produced by all vertebrates, including humans. And we have the structures of a number of halogenated hydrocarbons. Interestingly, the similarities in structure that we observe here mean that many of these halogenated hydrocarbons exhibit estrogenic activity. In other words, they bind to the estrogen receptor, activating it, albeit in a less efficient manner than the native ligand 17-beta estradiol. One class of halogenated hydrocarbons are the polychlorinated biphenyls. And so polychlorinated biphenyls are discussed briefly here because of their widespread nature and the large problem, the significant degree of problems they pose as in terms of environmental issues. So these are compounds that were manufactured between 1929 and 1979 when they were at least made illegal in the United States. And these were utilized for a number of industrial applications, including cooling fluids, cutting oils, any kind of application in which you needed to keep something cool and stable that was likely to not remain so as a result of the action that was taking place. So, for example, in factories where large sheets of metal were being cut and the blades would heat up, PCBs were an excellent lubricating agent that helped to stabilize everything. Interestingly, another application of PCBs is their use in electrical transformers. In this case, you have a high degree of electric current that's passing through a very small space and a small number of wires in a concentrated area. And so PCBs provide a cooling and stabilizing agent in this situation. So PCBs are composed of two phenyl rings, and we see the structure down there at the bottom of one of the most toxic, what's referred to as congeners of PCBs. In other words, to make a PCB, you have two rings of carbon. The rings are shown there in the center of the diagram there. The rings consist of 6 carbons. So you see there's 6 angles that are found there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in these rings. And then there are chlorines that are attached to them in different manners. So there are 209 possible different congeners. Some of them were more widely synthesized than others, and interestingly, toxicity of these compounds was congener dependent. So some congeners, like the PCB77 that we see in the middle of the slide at the bottom, were particularly toxic and problematic. In fact, PCB77 is one of the 3 most toxic congeners of polychlorinated biphenyls. So PCBs are problematic when they enter the environment and organisms are exposed to them. They can lead to developmental abnormalities, adverse reproductive effects outside of developmental abnormalities, such as decreased reproductive output in organisms that produce more than one offspring, and carcinogenic effects. Certainly, they're tied to the development of cancer. There have been a few unfortunate instances in which human beings have been exposed to high concentrations of PCBs. Yusho and Yu-Ching disease are 2 examples of such an incident. And so in this case, the people that were exposed, and these are really tragic situations, by the way, in which there were PCBs that were introduced into rice oil. So rice oil, to be honest, is a pretty good substance to dissolve in which PCBs can be dissolved. When I was in grad school working with PCBs, we would oftentimes dissolve PCBs in corn oil. And so rice oil or corn oil are excellent dissolving agents for these compounds. We were intentionally exposing to organisms to these PCBs and monitoring the effects. And so what we observed, unfortunately, in the humans that were exposed here was an increased incidence of goiter. A goiter, of course, is an enlarged thyroid gland for reasons that we'll talk about momentarily. And we also observed, unfortunately, a statistically demonstratably different lower IQ in children that were born to these women who had been exposed to PCBs. We also saw an increased instance of mental retardation and hearing impairment as a result of the role that thyroid hormone plays in the development of the hearing system. There was also a study in the United States in which women who lived around the Great Lakes were studied, and we examined how many fish from the Great Lakes these women consumed during the course of their pregnancy. In this particular case, it was demonstrated that women who consumed a certain number of fish had children born to them that had, again, demonstratively lower IQs, poorer verbal comprehension, and distractibility. Now, all of these effects are tied to the effects of PCBs on the development of the nervous system because of their impacts on thyroid hormone. But the overall significance is that these are compounds that are found in the environment. In fact, PCBs are ubiquitous in the environment. They were so widely used and so poorly managed in terms of their disposal that PCBs, low levels of PCBs, are found throughout the world as a result of atmospheric transport, including in human tissues. If we were to look at the levels of PCBs in our tissues, we would find that it's not zero unless we have never consumed fish here on the face of the earth. Then we have some low levels of PCBs that are found within our tissues, hopefully low enough that they're going to have no impact upon our overall health. PCBs fall into this category of endocrine disrupting compounds, and so they exhibit, of course, endocrine disrupting effects. These are organic compounds that interfere with the endocrine system, as we've talked about previously in class. And so the basic idea is this, that if we watch the animation on the screen, we see estrogen binding to the estrogen receptor, bringing about feminization of the cell following that binding. PCBs, on the other hand, have a similar shape to estrogen. They also can make contact with the estrogen receptor and bring about a similar feminization of the cell. So this is not a trivial observation that we see here. This is something that we didn't consider could happen originally as we were synthesizing these molecules, but we now understand that many of the molecules we've synthesized have the potential to bring about endocrine disrupting effects. On the board, we see a graph of human sperm count, and we do see these long-term trends as we look back as far as we possibly can that include things like a decrease in sperm count that we're fairly certain is tied to increased exposure to these endocrine disrupting compounds. PCBs also have other types of endocrine disrupting effects outside of the estrogenic effects that we just observed. So in this particular case, we are looking at the effects of PCBs on the so-called thyroid hormone axis, AXIS. An axis is a system that controls a hormone within the body. In this particular case, what we see is this, that the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone goes back up and has a negative feedback impact on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So if we go back a couple steps, we see that the hypothalamus, a portion of our brain close to the cranial floor, produces a hormone called thyroid releasing hormone, TRH. This TRH goes to the pituitary. It causes the pituitary to produce TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which then goes to the thyroid gland and causes the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. So as long as thyroid hormone is making its way back to the pituitary and the hypothalamus, then this negative feedback system, as it's referred to, works fairly nicely. However, what we see is this, that PCBs induce an enzyme referred to as UDPGT. And so UDPGT, as it says on the screen there, increases T4 elimination. When T4 is gone, it doesn't have that negative impact on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So this means that the thyroid gland is bombarded by TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And this is nearly always the cause of a goiter, like the goiter that we see on the screen. Now, goiters are not always caused by exposure to pollution. Certainly, the most common cause worldwide is a dietary deficiency of iodine and an inability to produce thyroid hormone. But in this case, we see that pollution, PCBs in particular, can lead to thyroid hormone disruption and the presence of a goiter. And again, the presence of a goiter is not the worst. It's a reversible effect. And so the most insidious effects of thyroid hormone disruption are the neurological disorders and developmental disruption that we observed over the past few moments. We spent a bit of time talking about hazardous waste disposal at this point in our chapter. We have three mechanisms that are commonly used to dispose of hazardous waste. Now, there are certainly other possibilities, but these are the three main mechanisms that are used in the United States to get rid of hazardous waste. One possibility are surface impoundments. This may be surprising, but interestingly, these surface impoundments are heavily lined with leak detection systems in place. Now, I will point out this was not always the case, and so there are some famous incidents that occurred when there either were no were no liners in place, and certainly no leak detection systems in place. Russellville, Kentucky is such a prime example of such a situation in which hazardous wastes, PCBs in particular, were placed into a non-lined system, and from now until the end of time, there will be PCBs present in the karst topography. That means there are many caves in that area. The karst topography around Russellville, Kentucky, unfortunately. So ideally, though, if they're done correctly, and these days they should be, unless there's some unusual activity going on, then if they're permitted and done correctly, then they're lined, and so none of the liquid seeps into the earth, and essentially the not extremely toxic, but for example, the output of a paper mill. This is a paper mill in Alabama in the picture that we see on the screen. So it requires a great deal of water. The output is slightly toxic. So this water goes out into this settling pond. The toxic waste falls to the bottom. The water evaporates. And this goes on and on and on for an extended period of time. Eventually, then this particular impoundment is deactivated, and so something has to be done, of course, with all the toxic waste that's been placed into that settling pond. This is not acutely, this is not radioactive waste, for example, from a nuclear power plant, and so it can be handled, but a surface impoundment is one possibility for handling toxic waste. Number two, so landfills are a possibility for handling hazardous waste. Now, we want to be careful about our terminology here. So what we see is this, that there's only 21 landfills in the United States that are permitted for truly hazardous waste. These are secure landfills, and they're heavily protected. So here we see some nuclear waste being buried at a site near Richland, Washington, in the western United States. Now, this is a big deal. And so, nuclear power is something that we probably won't have an opportunity to talk about in our class, but it's a fairly clean source of energy, but generates a very small amount of very toxic waste. And so here we see that very toxic waste being disposed of. But in general, the landfills are widely used for disposing of garbage and moderately toxic waste. Toxic waste that goes into the landfills must be stabilized and neutralized. In other words, you can't put strong acids or bases into a landfill. It is true that landfills are difficult to monitor and regulate. I mean, you would know that simply by looking at a landfill. And so, as I've spoken to you before in class, one of the landfills that always impresses me is the one that if you're on Interstate 64, right before you get to Moorhead, if you're headed east on 64, there's a huge landfill on the left-hand side of the interstate. And so this particular landfill is just a mountain of garbage that has been placed there over decades. And so you can imagine, on the next slide, we'll see how much waste every person in the United States throws away on average per day. So there's just so much waste going into these landfills that it's very difficult to determine if there is any hazardous waste mixed in with the non-hazardous waste. And when I say hazardous waste, I mean acutely hazardous waste. For example, it's been perhaps 2 years ago in Irvine, Kentucky, in the landfill, there was radioactive waste that was accidentally introduced into the landfill. This created quite an issue that took a number of weeks to deal with, and who knows if that was all that the radioactive waste was removed. It wasn't legal to put it there, but it was a situation in which it was detected and, to the best of our ability, removed from that non-permitted facility. So if we look at the United States, we have 3,000 active and 10,000 closed landfills, which is kind of incredible. Each American throws out 4.4 pounds of trash per day. Although it depends, it varies widely depending on a number of factors, including what part of the nation that you live in and socioeconomic class, and unquestionably how interested you are in minimizing that as well. So we see the basic outline of a landfill below, and so the essential idea is that the landfills are lined, and there's this big indentation, ideally, in the earth. It wouldn't have to be, but you're going to be able to fit a lot more waste into it if that's the case. And so then the landfill is filled up over a number of years. Ideally, it's big enough that we're making significant use of it. And then these pipes have to be placed down into the landfill to allow methane to escape from now until the end of time. The landfills are capped, very last thing, as we see with the clay cap. And interestingly, one of the focuses recently has been the repurposing of these landfills. And so things like golf courses, parks, retail centers, perhaps even natural areas can be placed on top of these landfills once they are appropriately capped and closed. Lastly, and here we're getting into a situation where we're talking about much more toxic waste. Another possibility for getting rid of very toxic waste is deep well injection. So in this particular case, we have these wells that are lined with numerous pipes. The waste is injected, interestingly, below the water level. And so here in this particular diagram, we see these various aquifers that are present. And so you can see different levels of aquifers with zones of impermeable rock between them. Then we see a large layer of impermeable rock. And then finally, we see the injection zone down below this water. So ideally, the toxic waste is placed far below the level of the water. We've gotten ourselves into trouble many times as humans by, of course, placing toxic chemicals. Sometimes these were organic toxins. The Soho epidemic that we talked about of cholera in London is such an example, because we throw toxic things into the earth, and then we're also drinking water that comes from wells, and of course you can see the issue there. So ideally, we're trying to avoid that here by placing these toxic compounds below the level of the water. So this needs to be in a geologically stable area, clearly. So earthquakes here are going to be extraordinarily problematic, and there's 143 of these deep well injection sites that are permitted in the Gulf Coast region alone. So those are the ways we're supposed to dispose of hazardous chemicals. We now spend a bit of time talking about what happens when hazardous chemicals are not disposed of properly. Now, I will point this out. There's a lot of incentive to not dispose of hazardous chemicals properly because disposing of them properly costs a great deal of money. You may recall the scenes from The Simpsons where Smithers and Mr. Burns are dumping their toxic chemicals into a lake at night, and so that's the idea of midnight dumping. So, it's extraordinarily disappointing that this ever occurred, but if you're extremely selfish and care nothing about killing, essentially, other human beings, then you can take your toxic compounds, if you can get away with it, and dump them somewhere in the environment where everyone will be exposed to them, and then get away and no one knows that it was you that put them there. So midnight dumping, historically, was extraordinarily disturbing. And we also see, right after that, orphan sites. So the idea, I'm so sorry, but orphan sites are this. It's a site where there was a toxic waste dump, probably an improperly permitted toxic waste dump. And then the people run it for a period of time and just leave it and clear out. And so there's no owner, there's no one that can be responsible, hence the name orphan site. One of the most famous examples of an orphan site, you'll be excited to know, occurs right here in Kentucky in the direction of Louisville, outside of Louisville, Kentucky. It's famously referred to as the Valley of the Drums. And so the Valley of the Drums was a situation in which an enterprising individual had a toxic waste disposal business. As I pointed out, it cost a lot of money to dispose of toxic waste. And so this individual was collecting relatively large sums of money by disposing of toxic waste for universities and industry. Well, that's potentially fine. The bad news is this individual didn't have any ability or intention of disposing of toxic waste properly, but rather they had about a 30-acre site there near Louisville, and so they simply took the toxic waste drums to that site. They buried them on the site, just a few feet below the surface, and eventually they didn't even bury them anymore. They were just stacked up there at the site. And the way the permits were at the time, this was clearly highly unethical behavior, but the way the permits were at the time, it took people decades to realize what this individual was doing. When they realized what he was doing, he actually passed away shortly after that. And it was this huge orphan site, 2.5 million barrels in this particular site. And this is one of those sites that will be contaminated from now until the end of time. They capped it as best they could. There's now a huge barbed wire fence all the way around it. A couple times it's been expanded because waste has seeped out of the site, and the waste has been detected off-site, and they've expanded the area which is restricted there. But there's essentially nothing to do about it. It's simply too expensive and maybe not even possible, even if we had all the money in the world to throw at it. So it's an orphan site, and hopefully our regulations have improved to prevent such situations in the future. But we have learned some difficult lessons in the past on disposing of hazardous waste. Another famous example of hazardous waste mismanagement is Love Canal. And so Love Canal was this. It was a canal that was originally going to be built to bypass Niagara Falls. The problem was it was never finished. And so a company put a lot of money into partially building this canal, which of course left you with a giant hole. And that property changed hands. The new owners thought, yeah, you know what, a good hole would be good for putting toxic waste into. And so the city of Niagara, the Army, Hooker Chemical Company, all put all sorts of toxic waste into this big hole, elongated hole, maybe a trench would be a better word, that existed as a result of the attempt to build this canal around Niagara Falls. And so things like PCBs, benzenes, dioxin. And so we mentioned dioxin before in the context of Agent Orange. It was the problematic chemical that was included in Agent Orange. All these things were placed into this ditch and filled up and covered over with dirt. Eventually, the site was covered with dirt, inappropriately capped, and it was sold to the school board for $1. And so you may be familiar with this idea of selling something for $1. It just is a symbolic exchange where you're giving something to someone, but this is something that you would not want to receive. Now, what I'm about to say, as unlikely as it seems, did take place. And so on this property, there were 2 schools and 900 homes built, but the presence of the waste that was present, buried there, was not fully disclosed. Now, I did mention that there are developments that occur on top of, not toxic waste dumps, but landfills today. And so hopefully we are, these are things that are capped appropriately, and so everything is fine regarding the development that occurs on top of them. But in this case, there was nothing that was done properly. This was before the period of time in which we understood how to properly cap these toxic waste dumps. Although, to be honest, we dumped the waste before we put a liner in, so I'm not certain if anything could have been done in this particular case. The contamination was detected in 1978, and it was one of these cases, a few of which have occurred in the history of the United States, when people in those areas started to experience a high degree of health issues, a high rate of miscarriages, cancer, epilepsy, leukemia. And so eventually, you see a picture from a newspaper on the right-hand side there. People are in their basement in the Love Canal region. I don't think I'd be standing in the toxic waste like that gentleman is, or touching the floor without gloves on, but they're pointing to the toxic waste that's seeping up from the basement. And so, interestingly, the end of the Love Canal story is that the schools were purchased and all the homes were purchased, everyone was moved out, and it remains a toxic waste site to this day. And so, of course, that's a huge debacle. None of that should have happened. None of that development should have happened in that area in the first place. Now, those are a couple of very famous environmental mishaps that have occurred in the history of the United States, and they led to the development of something referred to as Superfund. Now, the less catchy name for the Superfund Act is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA. And so this was passed in 1978. You'll note that Love Canal, the contamination was detected in, did I say that right? It was passed in 1980. You'll note that the Love Canal contamination was detected in 1978. And essentially, what we said as a nation was that, okay, we have a problem here. So we have messed up in the past. There's nothing we can do about going back in time and preventing these contaminated sites, but we need some sort of fund in place that allows us to deal with these highly contaminated sites and protect people from them. And so this act authorizes the Environmental Protection Agency to determine the responsible party in the toxic dump sites and force them to pay for cleanup. And if there is no payer, like in the case of the Valley of the Drums, there was an individual and he had passed away and he did not have sufficient money, and so the government, of course, has to pick up that tab, and so that's the purpose of the Superfund Act. Now, Superfund sites then are these sites that are highly toxic and distributed throughout the United States. In 2022, there was 1,329 on the national pollutant list, and many of these are actually military bases, as will not be surprising to you. I talked to you briefly about the Paducah Gaseous Diffusion Plant, in which high levels of radiation contamination exist to this day. And so these are areas that once they're designated as a Superfund site, then there are special funds, the Superfunds, the money from the Superfund Act that can be accessed to help deal with them. Most often, this is simply partitioning off these areas and preventing people from accidentally becoming exposed to these compounds. But in some cases, it is possible to clean up the toxins that have been introduced into the environment. But if you hear that an area is a Superfund site, then you immediately know, okay, that is some serious toxic contamination that's present in that area. So here we see some interesting figures. On the right-hand side, we see a map that has 3 different colors of dots. The red-ish dots are the final list of Superfund sites. The green are the proposed sites, and the lightish green sites are the ones that have actually been cleaned up. I also thought it would be interesting to look at the sites that we find in Kentucky. So if we look over at the left-hand side, we see a number of the Superfund sites that are found in Kentucky. You'll notice, well, one that I've talked about before. So you see the Paducah Gaseous Diffusion Plant, where we used to commonly work. There on the list of Superfund sites in the state of Kentucky. Another one that you'll see that may be of some interest is the Maxey Flats Nuclear Disposal Site. And so this is a site that's in the direction of Moorhead, between Moorhead and Maysville. And the history is an interesting one, but essentially there's some extremely radioactive waste that's buried at that site, and that site is another one that cannot be cleaned up, but that will be contaminated until the end of time. Now, as we've mentioned, the ideal situation is that the polluter that placed the toxic compounds into the environment pays for the cleanup. Now, I will point out that almost always these are corporations. Very rarely is an individual, now the Valley of the Drums is an exception, but very rarely is an individual placing highly toxic compounds in the environment. And so we as in the United States, has been relatively successful with this in the past and to date. So 70% of cases, the polluter has been the entity that paid for the cleanup. But as I pointed out, if the polluter is unavailable, then the Superfund Trust pays. And so on average, cleanups takes 12 years and cost $20 million, if you can believe that. Now, this is also interesting, I thought, as we close our Superfund discussion. And so in some cases, it's simply the areas in which the contamination is found are simply too contaminated to build houses, but they're not quite contaminated enough for the national pollutant list. And so this impairs about $2 trillion of real estate in the United States. And so in this particular case, partial cleanup and repurposing is the goal. Interestingly, we have different standards for housing and businesses. And so partial cleanup to the point where it can be safe for humans to work is the goal. And then industry can come in and purchase those properties at a severe discount and create a small industrial area in those particular regions. It's fair to point out that these industrial regions tend to be kind of contaminated regardless, because they're producing large amounts of toxic chemicals and moving those around. And so this is a pretty effective use of these sites, which are referred to as brownfields. And so they're not totally cleaned up, but they're not so contaminated that they're completely unusable. So as an example, a smoked meat company built a $5.2 million warehouse on an illegal dump in Chicago. They employ 100 workers and are quite successful there in their brownfield site. Lastly, we close our chapter with a brief discussion of another sort of environmental debacle, leaking underground storage tanks. Interestingly, in this case, we're primarily talking about gas stations. And so one of the things you may not think about frequently is that when you go buy gas, the gas that you're purchasing has to be stored underground. And so clearly that gas is highly flammable. To safely store it, it has to be down underneath the earth. So there are these huge tanks that are found underneath the gas stations. And as it turns out, those tanks, when they were installed, had about a 20-year lifespan. And so in order to operate legally, after 20 years, a gas station has to dig up the tank, replace the tank with a new tank, and then launch into this next 20-year lifespan. So in 2011, there were 501,000 failures that were reported in the United States, and these failing underground storage tanks for gasoline were the most common source of groundwater contamination. They're strictly regulated by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Sorry about the error with the bullet points. And what we see is that by 2014, there were 450,000 cleanups that were reported. But it's also worth noting that this was a point in time that you may have just heard of in general conversation or illustrated in like TV shows or something of that nature. This was a point at which many gas stations ceased to exist. So they had enough money to put the tank in originally and to get going, but they didn't plan for this massive expense of replacing the tank after 20 years. And so there was a shift in terms of the number of small gas stations that existed at the point when those tanks started to fail.